The King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
And welcome to the Broadcasters Podcast. This is King of Podcasts. If you look at my website, I did a little redesign on it, a little more of the red and black hue to it. I don't know, wanted to redesign it. But you can still find all my production information, social media, all that good stuff. kingofpodcasts.com, all of the programming that I do on the network on a regular basis. So that includes the Rest of Real podcast, this program, the Parade the Debauchers, and Podcasters Row. Plus, if you like the idea of, that I used to be a pretty good music DJ back in the day, did a lot of that before. Well, if you want to go ahead and check that out for yourselves, I actually put together and curate 4 playlists regularly on Spotify. You can find that also there on the website, kingofpodcasts.com. All right, into the program tonight. We follow back up on our conversation on the news, which is continuing to go ahead and go through some various troubles. And, whatever they can get to do and talk about on a regular basis, they're going to try, because they are struggling right now to get any content that will just stick. And there's a lot of issues going on altogether. So, traditional media massacred again with major layoffs. That was somebody could programming 2 weeks ago. We're back to it again because there's just things that are going on that are not helping the industry at all. Sports might be on the upside. We got the Super Bowl this weekend. So, I remember last year, I think I did a sports related episode. I'm not going to do that again because I noticed it didn't do much for people anyway. We'll just leave that out there into the ether. But the news and the podcasting side, they're going in 2 different directions. And part of it is because podcasting as a new medium, when you don't really have to put too much into the podcast itself in terms of the budget. I mean, it's a radio show in essence. Even if you're doing video production, you're not putting that much into it. And there's a lot of podcasters that can really do well and make an income off of it. Like, I'm still trying to make an income off of this. I mean, I make something. It's not even close to what I could really use as a supplemental income that I can go ahead and live off of. Not even close. But I have made money for a number of years doing these programs. Just not much. And I've tried my hardest to go and get on the YouTube and get that platform up and going. But I've been at it for 6 years? And I've struggled to get my subscriber count, because there's only so much that I can do up there to get people to go and listen. And, I'll even get a survey today from the YouTube creators. And I'm like, yeah, I can't get my subscriber count up. I can't do much to do anything. Now, I'm at a disadvantage because my programming on purpose, just to make sure I'm staying above ground or above board, I keep my content at 18 plus just to be safe. But that hinders my growth because of the fact that, the only thing I can do really, they're going to limit my content because of the 18 plus issue. Like, I don't want them to give me any crap. Oh, there's some of my content. It must be 18 plus. Well, I know that's true. At the least, I know by the Parade the Debauchers content has to be 18 plus because of the content I might get into might be a little bit salacious or graphic in nature or sexual in content. The Broadcasters Podcast is more professional, but, like I said, it's what I do here. I've done some changes to the website, by the way, to see if maybe, the Spotify audience will find this programming a little bit easier. But it's not like these other platforms that give me that much to go and do to monetize. Unless I create premium programming, I'm not going to do that either. But a lot of the people like myself have learned how to get themselves out there and move along with some real movement in content. Like, there are really some people out there that these big corporate companies are saying, well, we're going to do something with this to try to get more out there and get more people to go ahead and follow along and, get more interest in what they're doing in the programming or what my programming is really doing and getting more people to listen. So hopefully that will change and become something more often, more happenstance. What about that? Let's get into podcasting itself. One of the big stories that happened late last week that really caught my attention, Joe Rogan. Among all, last week, he signed a new renewal with Spotify worth up to $250 million. $250 million, but the podcast now will no longer be exclusive to the platform. So Joe Rogan Experience now goes back up once again and has been exclusive on Spotify for 3 years, will now be available on other audio platforms. And Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube will once again see his show back up there once again. Now, this is a move under Spotify's revised strategy to give up exclusive streaming rights in favor of broader distribution, which the company kicked off in 2023. And so now you have Spotify doing this with Joe Rogan to, not exclusive, make him exclusive, which makes sense. To me, it does. So anyway, Spotify said they will work closely with Rogan and his team to continue to maximize the audience of the show across platforms. And this is after he, 3.5 years ago, signed a deal worth more than $200 million for his program. He's still the number one podcast across the globe, according to Spotify. And according to the Edison Research's Quality of Ear survey, the most recent survey of the third quarter, it's number one for the period, and number two most listened podcast for women 13 and older, according to Edison Research. The share of ear, that's what it is. That's what they want to call it. That's right. So they got that going on, and that continues going forward. Now, as for, among other things that this causes, there's a lot of other sites that are out there that are looking to go and follow suit. Because when we look at Odyssey, we look at iHeartMedia, all the radio resources that are using podcasting and they have it as another revenue stream, they see the growth there. And it's still there. So Vulture goes in more detail about this, and they say that today Spotify is one trying to practice what market analysts try to euphemistically call cost discipline after years of splurging backfire. Now, the podcasting audience, the podcasting platforms, they're starting to learn from their experience of putting out content and trying to spend money on content, because especially around 2020, everybody was doing that. But it's not working as much, right? I mean, think about it like this. The platforms, they're going to make money on podcasts because of the advertising and of other things they can do with it. But being able to make sure that their platforms are made available for content is more important than trying to go and create their own content. So there were multiple rounds of layoffs that happened last year, new talent deals that are getting smaller and controlled for risk, which includes Trevor Noah's podcast. Spotify is now on the back foot, flailing about for opportunities and keeping costs down. They've integrated audiobooks, video, AI, and Rogan almost certainly had all the leverage going into the renegotiation. So Joe Rogan can go ahead and remonetize his program on YouTube once again and put those 3 years of programming up there if he wants to. Now, for Joe Rogan's program, it'll still continue to generate advertising revenue. Cash is good for Spotify now that tech companies are actually proving that they can be profitable. And advertisers keep getting excited to talk about Spotify, about Megaphone, their podcast hosting and monetization platform, becoming central to paying off the huge bet they placed on the category over the past few years. Now, other podcasts are also getting a big deal of discussion right now from Spotify. Audio episodes of Call Her Daddy will no longer be exclusive to the platform. Call Her Daddy is one of the last Spotify exclusive podcasts. The platform still has some original productions behind the wall, their IP dabbling audio drama Batman Unburied, and among others. Now, when Spotify first came into play and started throwing a lot of money into podcasts, especially in 2020, they didn't necessarily have a plan, according to Vulture, and that the last few years, the grand podcast feature they helped usher in is one that ultimately looks a lot like the past. An ecosystem that on the upper echelons at least looks like old school radio, because podcasting is radio 2.0. Remember that. I said that. So other podcast news, like Smartless, the wildly popular Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, Sean Hayes Celebcast, is moving from Amazon to SiriusXM for $100 million per Bloomberg. And it's starting to shake out. In a recent investor call, Scott Greenberg says it's starting to shake out, quote, in a reminiscent way of terrestrial radio and some other things. And when Vulture talks about that, podcasting these days has started to look like what it did in its earlier years, he's referring to how wide swaths of today's podcast mainstays are probably the same as they were in the 2000s. Chat shows, iterations of what you found on broadcast radio. Perhaps most importantly, the push toward walled gardens has been abandoned for now, with podcasting swinging back to open publishing. Right. You could try to go and put premium content out there, but unless you think you can get the money for it and you have a big enough audience that you can go and swing a smaller audience willing to go and spend more money to listen to more content, you have to have that big enough audience. Which I guess you can, but it's very difficult. And that's what they're talking about with all this here. And at the end of the day, Spotify plowed through so much money to get ahead, only to seemingly end up right next to SiriusXM. Yeah, it's not a bad place to be, but Spotify is multi-platform. To get people to go and stay engaged and subscribe to the platform for audiobooks, for podcasting, for music, I mean, they're putting a lot of content there to keep you in track. And Spotify, to me, besides, Apple Podcasts, I'm sure is very well done. You see there's changes in the podcasting lineup where Google Podcasts is phasing out so that YouTube and YouTube Music are exclusively podcast portals, more audio driven, especially YouTube Music. So they're trying to make that very much more prominent than before. And very much audio centric for YouTube as well, to add that extra component. And I like that. I mean, I know that for me, I get a lot of audience from YouTube. This is the thing, but it is tough to go ahead and be a monetizer. You got to work your way up. But like I said, with my obstacles of trying to build up content, it is going to be difficult for me to go ahead and get the audience to be where it needs to be. And I agree with that. Meanwhile, I still get a pretty good audience that listens to my content over there. Like when I look at my content right now, 60 to 70% of my content is listened to on YouTube versus where I have it through audio hosts. Just the way it is. And I'm not sure how that actually works, but I just think that YouTube really doesn't do much for me to help get my content out there to other people. Enough people out there to really, make it much. But I'm trying to work on it. And if you want to go and help me out, at King of Podcasts on YouTube, just look for me up there. All my content's up there, going back to 2018. I'd love for you to go and check it out for yourselves, subscribe to it, and please let others to subscribe the same way. Would really help out. And as a result of all this, Spotify might be profitable this year. So Spotify is saying that their investors are thrilled, but the podcast industry less so. The Verge reports on this. So Spotify reported fourth quarter earnings. Company still operates at a loss, but the margins on podcasting do seem to be actually improving. So Daniel Ek told investors, their CEO, that we're close to break even on the business, which gives me a lot of confidence that when we get into 2024, we will achieve the full year profitability target on podcasting. So they expect the money to come on up. And this is where podcasting has gone through a lot of changes anyway. Keep that in mind too. And Daniel Ek talks about the exclusivity model in their fourth quarter earnings call and says that it served its purpose. Quote, what we've been able to see here, as we've been learning over these past few years, is that while some of these exclusivity deals worked, generally it wasn't in line with what the creator wanted. And it makes sense when you're the smaller player trying to gain scale. But when you're the bigger player, the additional value of the exclusivity is far smaller than it is about being aligned. And then he downplayed the magnitude of Spotify's former strategy that not all podcasts were exclusive to the platform. But Spotify is looking to profit now. Spotify is getting their directions in the right way, in the right manner. And as for iHeartRadio and iHeartMedia, their executive is podcasting the rules he talks about to Radio Inc. And that Chris Peterson, who served as iHeart's executive vice president of podcasting during the How Stuff Works acquisition, he has now founded a new company, Download Media, DWN Load Media. He says that he's bullish about the industry. The layoffs and tension over high-dollar contracts have been a market correction, which he says is a healthy adjustment, paving the way for sustainable growth and innovation as the podcast industry continues to mature. And he outlined several key areas for poised for growth within the podcasting industry, and this is according to his information. He writes that new technology enhancing ad tech and attribution offers untapped opportunities for increased advertising spend. Subscription models, already successful in international markets, are now promising significant revenue potential for U.S.-based podcast networks. And he recognizes the value of major companies agreeing to licensing agreements as opposed to straight-out buying content. And that lowering podcast production spend, he's advocating for that, because he says that podcaster companies are exploring new additional revenue streams and leveraging growing video platforms like YouTube to reach new audiences. And international expansion, you're seeing new markets like outside of the U.S., like China and Southeast Asia. And there's an importance of thinking globally and leveraging intellectual property across borders to maximize the industry's growth potential. It's a lot there going into what they're doing and what they're planning on to do. So, looks good. The podcasting industry in general, the market now has reached $17.9 billion in 2023 and expected to reach $144 billion by 2032. Podcasting still has room to go, but it is difficult to try to make it on your own. Look, I mean, for some people, I'll tell you like this. When I talk to certain podcasters out there on my Podcasters Road podcast, right? And I haven't done a lot of them lately, but when I put out a request, I'll get some people on and I'll go ahead and talk to them. And, we'll take some time to go and learn about some new podcasters out there and see what happens. One of the things I'm noticing is that I think I've done 16 episodes of that. Not a lot of them are doing very frequent programming. Some are doing really frequent and very consistently. And you can tell the difference and what they're doing, how they sound, and what their effort is. It's still very difficult, nevertheless. But I am appreciative of what they're doing in terms of that the content's out there. And I think one of the things you got to think about when it comes to overall success in podcasting, I don't talk much about like the mentoring and what you should do in terms of being a better podcaster. I did do a podcasting 101 series, and I did 30 episodes, 31, 30 like 2-minute long segments, and I put them up on my TikTok feed, Acting a Podcast. They're still up there. And on Instagram, as a matter of fact. So, but those are just like kind of pet peeves. But overall in podcasting, and look, I do podcasting on a regular basis now for a number of clients on my full-time work. There are a number of things I really take into account. Yeah, you do need to find ways to kind of draw the audience in and bait them in. So the clips that you're seeing out there that people are putting out for social media, you absolutely need to keep doing it. It is the one thing that so far I've been doing for myself finally in October. I finally got onto it. I started using Headliner app. And when I have time, I will go ahead and clip out 2 clips per episode that I create. And that's 3 times a week, unless I do Podcasters Row. And I'm not even using the automation version of it. I'm clipping them out myself. And I use my existing graphics and everything like that. Right now I do everything on my own. And that's part of the thing. For me to go and do these podcasts, on average, besides I'm curating topics on a regular basis, like every day I might go to Google News, or I might go to, just do some Google searches, and I will find stories that will be catching my attention that I want to go ahead and use for the program. So I use the For You page for Google, or I'll look at things on, social media, whether it's YouTube or X or Instagram or, TikTok. And I will look and see what there is out there. Kind of get a gauge of what people are talking about in some cases. If especially something pop culture for this program, I'll take that into consideration. But then the content itself. There are enough things out there now to really create a great program. But one of the things I have to do too is you have to keep reinvesting. When you can get a better microphone, do it. If you can do some better work to go ahead and, record the program, do it. Keep listening to yourself back, see what you're doing, if it's right or not, do it. Right? One of the things I'm doing right now in my studio, as a matter of fact, and this is one of the littlest things you could be thinking about, but honestly, I care. So I record this, and I have audio panels up on the wall to break down some of the sound, and it works well. And one of the things I never got fixed, even after this, you don't hear it now because of what I do in the processing of the program when I do it in post-production. But I'm fixing something right now to even fix it even better. And that's I have a ceiling fan in the room that I work in. And the ceiling fan has been up there for a long time. I'm looking at it as we speak. And it does make some noise. And it's not so much where it's like the noise of just the rotation of the fan, but it's also the fact that that fan, as it's moving, it's gotten a little bit shaky, and, maybe there's a little bit of dust or something in the mechanism that does create a sound up there. Knowing like a fire alarm with the battery not replaced, something like that, right? But it does bother me because I notice it's up there. And I remember I had the hardest time trying to go and reduce the noise and get rid of it. When what I should really do is replace it. Well, I finally ordered a new ceiling fan. It's a flush mount fan. It's a bigger one than I had before, so that when the blades go ahead and move around, I don't have to move it. I don't have to put it at full speed. So a much bigger fan. And then what I'm going to do is I'll have that on and set when I do my podcast. But it'll be much quieter, much easier to go and work off of. And the noise that I had before goes away. It's the last thing I have in here that could cause any noise. Seriously, if you can turn off even like the air conditioning just for a little bit, or the heater, or whatever you have, in the room that you're in, and you just listen to see if the computers or if the other equipment that you have around you is making any noise at all. Just check it to the most simplistic. That's very important to look at. The microphones, everybody does a really good job with microphones, by the way. I like what a lot of people do with microphones. They all have learned, there's certain microphones you use in the trade that are much better. EV3s, you're making Audio Technicas, using Rode mics. There's a lot of great mics out there. Me, I use the Shure SMV USB. And I've had this now for 3 years. I love it. I think I sound amazing on it. It's, kind of like the Joe Rogan mic. But this was one I got to work with, the SM7V. SM7, I actually got to work with in college radio, like 20 years ago. These rounded mics, the Joe Rogan mic, if you will. And when I worked with those, I'm like, man, those sound good. And I mean, really, everything in the production, the processing, my friend Adam, who has done great work in engineering for radio stations and various places I've worked at, as a matter of fact. It's a matter of audio sounding really. You got to make it sound really good. And plus, if you can find a way to go and make it compress so that when you're hearing yourself, it sounds so good. Make sure you feel really comfortable in what you're in. The environment, yeah, the aesthetics, the optics look nice for video, sure. Like if I want to do that and I could put a green screen up, I have one up, so I could do that. I might change the one I have here and put one up that I have found. There's another one that I found that's like a rounded green screen. I might put that here in my setup and replace what I have. Because I have a green fabric I've been using for a long time, but it doesn't stay there consistent. So I might switch it out. But continuously reinvesting to make sure you have a better sounding program. And let me tell you something. With radio stations, yeah, you might have chairs that might be a little bit uncomfortable, and then you're doing shows, and like if you're going to go and do on shows for a while, consider the amount of time you do your podcast. Consider the time you're going to make somebody go and listen to your program. For me, an hour for most of my programming. Podcasters Road, The Parade and the Debaucherous, I keep it 30 minutes. Because based on that audience, I think that's the attention span they'll go and take, unless it's something else I have on. For the Broadcasters Podcast, I need an hour because that's usually about amount of time that I need to cover everything I have on the program. The wrestling program, the same thing. Probably about an hour. I could go a little bit longer, I'm sure. And I used to go 2-3 hours on that program, but I don't do it anymore because I have to consider that there are other podcasters out there with programming that people are listening to. Plus, the other thing, too, is that you got to make sure you're giving content that is consistently what people want to listen to. Like, it's episodic. So another episode goes up. You want to make sure you're going to give somebody out there something they're going to want to listen to. And so I learned from my stats and all, okay, some programming will do better than others. Like if I wanted to go to the Super Bowl episode, I did one on Super Bowl commercials one year. I did one on, on sports programming last year, and they didn't do well. I know it because I look back at what I did. Like if I go back and look right now at every time I did the Broadcasters Podcast, and I did an episode that was on something during the Super Bowl weekend, it doesn't do well. And I know what I did because I know what I put in there and why I didn't do well. I can check. If I need to go back and look at all of it, I can go and check back and see, oh yeah, it didn't perform well, and I know why. And I understand why. And so, for instance, when I did this before, what was it, last year? Oh no, I did something different last year. I was talking about I was talking about Velma last year. Remember that? Oh my God. And then terrestrial radio I talked about too. Actually, those episodes didn't do too bad. But I didn't do Super Bowl coverage last year. I didn't do anything sports related last year, as a matter of fact. Now, when I did it before, and I go back looking at last year, 2022. When I go back to that, I'll tell you that what was it here? I'm looking back. If I go back to February of 2022, here we go. I did sports on TV and its unstoppable Super Bowl success. Now, I don't know how many people listen to the audio version of the program, but I will say that on YouTube, no response. No one even talked about it. And that was the problem. When I learned what I'm doing wrong, right? When I used to talk about censorship, same thing. There has to be a way you do it. And that was another thing I did wrong. But, I learned from it. And I can learn constantly from this and just realize, oh, this is what I need to go and do to make things different. And I go there and I go ahead and recorrect. And that's something you must do often when you're doing when you're doing any programming at all. You have to make sure you're going to do that pretty consistently so that you don't make that mistake. These are all pet peeves. I'm just kind of giving them out, It's a matter of the quality of your programming, the way it sounds, what you're providing in terms of content, crucial to what you're doing. And also being cognizant of the time that your listeners had to listen. You need to make sure to do that. Plus, you need to make sure you're on your game. You need to be able to go and talk. Let me tell you, pick the right time that works for you to go and do the show. Like me, I do it at night because this is when I'm most active, my most energetic, all of it. And I sit here. I got a nice, comfortable chair. I spent money on a new chair here, a nice recliner to sit and do these shows also for work. But still, I'm comfortable here. And even when I do my programs, I bet you some of you know the same thing. See, you record a podcast, during the morning or during the afternoon. You'll sound different than what you sound like at night. You should also find what time of day works best for you. So during the day, I have several programs I do for cannabisradio.com. One is Blunt Business. That's very structured. That's very business-like. That's interview format. Meanwhile, I'm doing monologues almost all the time for the programs I'm doing here right now, like this program. It's all monologue. And then also I used to do interviews before, but it was 3 years ago, I used to do constantly interviews that were attached to this. And I realized, you know what? They're okay, but I'm not doing it so much anymore. Didn't have to. You can let the shows evolve too. One of the biggest things I did last year, around this time last year, was I started adding more pop culture content. I was really going into issues like, BTS or chart manipulation, they're on the charts and it's that. Or, all the Taylor Swift talk I've done this year. I'll tell you, yeah, it does work. If you need to get something out there that people will get and talk about a little bit more before you get to something else, yeah, you take advantage of it. You got to take into account what people want to talk about if you want them to hear what you want to talk about. Does that make sense? The other story I have to talk about tonight is journalism, because so much is here now talking about it. And it's so many stories constantly addressing the issues when it comes to a lot of issues right now with everyone trying to go and see some light at the end of the tunnel for journalism, because it's all hurting. It's one of those things that happens. Not much you can do about it. And there's a lot of stories being talked about it pretty consistently across the board. So now, these are some of the things that we have more than anything. Now, coming up, I'm also going to talk about the Grammys a little bit and a little bit about TikTok and the Universal Music Group deal, which that got a lot of talk. Actually, it didn't do too bad. People were actually interested in it because it's one of the most significant stories of the year. So back to the news about media, news media in general. First of all, I'll take a story from the Loyola Marymount University student newspaper, the Los Angeles Loyolan. Story about navigating the future of media students amidst mass industry layoffs. So all the layoffs that happened a couple weeks ago. From the student's point of view, he's trying to go and figure out if journalism is still a place to go to study. I study journalism. I study communications. And you know what? Tom Likas was right. You don't need to study communications. To me, in the media anyway. Not anymore. So this writer here, he writes, this is Matthew Smith, a news intern at Loyola Marymount, and this Los Angeles Loyolan, makes the point that, and speaks to the senior journalism major and co-president of the Society of Professional Journalists at LMU. Quote, "It is really difficult because all industries of journalism right now are changing every day. It's hard to know which ones are going to survive and which aren't." And professors also chimed in on this, that the future industry lies in question, and professors insist there is still a place for young people in journalism. Kate Pickert, associate professor, chair of the journalism department, highlighted how current college students are well versed in digital and social media, providing unique skills for employers. Right. The thing is, that's part of your arsenal, your Swiss Army knife of materials. If you want to go into marketing, advertising, or you want to work for a company and you want to provide a way for them to market, advertise, promote, create presence for themselves, public relations, all that. Create media for a company as opposed to being with a media company. She says, quote, "I think young folks are really coming up and learning that stuff as they go. So I still do really think that young people have a lot of value for news organizations. And I think news organizations know that. But you just can't be focused into journalism itself. And it's an industry now has expanded beyond just written media." And Pickert notes that undergraduate students are learning audio, video, audience engagement skills in college that weren't necessarily taught decades ago when current newsroom writers were studying. Well, I know for me, I learned news writing, news reporting. I worked on audio. I worked on video. Well, and for me, I put myself into internships and also put myself into the campus media that was there. So the newspaper, the radio station. I worked in an actual newspaper for a while when I was working in a Palm Beach Post. And, I took that into account. I took video classes on campus as well as part of the curriculum. So, there was things that I had to be multimedia. Like, if you're going to do journalism, you can't just be written. You have to be multimedia. You got to be able to be multi-platforms now more than ever. Audra Verrier, a PhD, Associate Vice Provost of Career and Professional Development, says, quote, "Students really have to be prepared for transferable skills and the baseline things, such as career readiness, competencies that are going to serve in any industry. Every organization has to tell a story and share that story in news and media. So it might not be exactly what they originally expected their career to look like, but there's many other industries that can utilize those skill sets." Right. You need to be able to use that as part of the skill set in another industry. Because journalism standalone, if you're going to do it, you're not going to do it with a company anymore. Does that make sense? You're not going to get to that point. Now, moving along here, they say that in the stories, they emphasize the importance of adaptability, noting the conventional distribution of journalism is not only the option anymore. She encouraged students to remain open to pursuing other paths. Despite the changing industry and many layoffs, the public still consumes news publications in digital form, and noted that employment by a larger company is no longer required to publish journalism. "We journalists," quote, "are not beholden to a large organization to necessarily get a story out to the world. If you're going to be able to make a go for it on your own, you've got newsletter platforms, video platforms, audio platforms, and you're able to get yourself out there in a way that I definitely wasn't able to do in 1999. Yep. So that was written here, and let's go into more. There's a story that came out by Futurism.com, and they talked to a former Google News director saying that big tech is killing journalism. An ex-Googler, Jim Albrecht, wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post. He was, until 2023, the senior director for the search giant and major AI players news, Ecosystem's products division. AI is the real wolf that threatens the business of journalism. Ever since the internet rose to prominence, the media industry is bigger with tech giants over things like search results and composition models. Right. Remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about the fact that how the media industry, especially the news publications, thought, well, because of what Google and Bing and Yahoo and all these others are getting for content that people can search for, that these news outlets should be paid for by Google or Facebook or what have you, to the sounding number of $14 billion was a proposed number. Which, that's delusional. That's not going to happen. AI is now able to be both paraphrase and deliver news. Albrecht qualms that these qualms might be already mute. He says, quote, "To me, watching publishers bicker about payment for search results while larger language models advance at a silent, frenetic pace. It was like watching people squabble about the floral arrangements at an outdoor wedding while the largest storm cloud you can imagine moves silently closer." He makes a good point here. Now, due to this new technology, we're entering a digital world in which platforms might not need to link to news sites at all. They can just take the news, have a robot rewrite it, and publish it in their own products. You still need a human component. Like, you just can't have anybody just read the news. That's why with radio, you had certain people that were news journalists that would actually report the news. You need news reporters that can deliver the news with the right tone, the right feeling, all of it. It can't just be anybody. The current revenue model for the media industry isn't just flipped on its head, but shattered. An AI-powered news ecosystem who becomes the arbiter of information. For years, Google and Facebook have defended themselves against accusations of revenue theft on grounds that they were the only vehicles for news delivery. But now, apps like ChatGPT, Microsoft's Bing Search, Google's search generative experience, now we're hearing it's called Gemini, are entering the collective digital fold. Big tech is suddenly finding themselves creators of news content and the voice of which was heard. Albrecht also presents an imagined information world where various AI agents communicate with each other, ultimately to the consumer. And the day-to-day digital life, individual newspapers and otherwise news outlets have their own chatbots. They communicate with your personal AI assistant, which will brief you on the news, your day, your emails, respond for you, answer your questions, help you with your work. But, this is the part that Albrecht is not talking about. It's the content we're listening to and watching. Okay? Because news is ad-driven now. And some of these major corporations, they're looking to go ahead and use news as a means for revenue, for advertising. And when you're only delivering the news for the money and you're clouding up the opinion and the editorial and the news, then you know what happens? More than ever, people don't want to listen to the news. Not the way it's presented before. They'll go find it somewhere else. And then what you have to do if you're trying to read the news is you need to be able to go ahead and start decoding what is news and what's opinion and editorial. And that's the part you need to go and look at more and more than everything every day. It's happening too much. And part of it is they're talking about as well is that there are a lot of bosses in the journalism industry that are driving the business into the ground. The news business is on the fritz thanks to treachery, greed, and blundering from the executive suites. Now, aside from the story about the other publications that are going down, there is one that went down just recently, The Messenger, a Jimmy Finkelstein-led digital publication that only recently launched. They abandoned everything and had in a matter of minutes after Semaphore Max Tanny tweeted that the business was going under. They went through $50 million. The company's overlords deleted its Slack channels, shut down the email servers, pulled the plug on the website mere moments after notifying staff, leaving them with no jobs, no severance, and no clips. The Messenger. Done. That's the most recent source that's gone down. So more than 800 journalists have been laid off in the first 4 weeks of the year. One of the most consequential election years on record. Now, we're not going to talk about the election and the political talking about it. But look, if politics were done in a certain way, if politics were actually just a very honest sport, then people might care about it. But it's not. And on top of that, there's a lot of spin and conjecture and a whole lot of propaganda that's being put in the news on a regular basis. And this goes on whichever side of the aisle you are. You have to really go through and decode and decrypt what is news, what's the news that you're finding out. It's not about the news sources telling us who, what, when, where, and why. You have to go into the stories and find out those questions, the answers to those questions yourself. Maybe they're embedded in there, and if they're not, they have to go to another page or another site to be able to find that out. That's the part that's also very confusing and very confounding. Former executive Deadspin editor-in-chief Megan Greenwell derided the series of failings from the executives as the adults in the room. Quote, an ever-growing number of media owners are so exceedingly unwilling to reckon with the particulars of their own business that they refuse to accept our eagerness to help them make money. They're speaking a language no one else does, proud of their own inability to not just fail, but to understand the terms on which they're failing. From the top down, an increasingly plutocratic layer of decision makers are placing bad bets, getting wiped out, leaving their charges as holding the bag. It's now, for all intents and purposes, a civic crisis. So they cite forecast layoffs at New York Public Radio in September. And the network's union pointed to data from a consulting firm, Gartner, outlining how many mass sackings in the news media translate to unretrievable profit losses in the not-so-distant future. And the data, net benefits as anticipated by layoffs are offset by key recurring ingredients that range from the hiring of costly contractors to high employee turnover due to burnout, eventually to the loss of audience of trust. Then your publication staff gets too small, too underpaid, too exhausted to support your audience's expectations. New York Public Radio cut their staff by 6% at that point. And you can go through a lot of companies that go through the same process. So, for instance, Sports Illustrated became public in 2015. They fired their staff photographers. And they were no longer flush with cash. 2018, they had a media merger that they were affected by of epic proportions. The public's parent company, Time Inc., was scooped up by Meredith Corporation for $2.8 million. Then Meredith felt the 3 million subscriber periodical didn't fit into its lifestyle brand and sold off the intellectual property rights to the brand management company Authentic Brands Group for $110 million the following year. And then the licensing deal that they all went through, we know the story after that. The ever-growing wasteland is right now the fall of the wave of plutocratic interests that have been increasingly clawing their way into the executive suites at major media companies, hedge funds, private equity concerns, and other investment groups. By the way, that's how radio went down. That's why radio has been in decline like ever since. Hedge funds, private equity groups, investment groups, etc. Since the 2008 recession, such groups have gobbled up about half of the industry in order to milk papers for profits, according to a 2021 Financial Times analysis. Radio went through the same thing. They're just kind of following along the same suit here. When they're all underperforming, they're just going to come in like hedge funds, like vultures, and just pick apart the intellectual property. Whatever they want to get out of that, and that's it. And they'll just keep cutting down, whatever they want. No resources, no wherewithal, nothing. The Washington Post blamed this shrinkage on poor business decisions at the top, mainly from Jeff Bezos' new hand in its operations. He left the paper to its own devices since purchasing it in 2013. And the Messenger placed this loss on the shoulders of its billionaire founder, citing Finkelstein's not ready for primetime vision, coupled with management so poor that news of the outlet's executives' incompetence outperformed the actual product. The Messenger was half-heartedly attempting to create. Former employees claimed that the company ran the young outlet out on the ground in a futile effort to capitalize on trends and hashtags while spending an inordinate amount of money on pricey high-rise offices that its work-from-home employees rarely used. Jim Van High, co-founder of Axios and Political, told Puck, quote, I was pissed the moment I heard about this dumb idea. It was business malpractice and human cruelty at an epic scale. Anyone who knew anything about the economics of media knew it would die quickly, spectacularly, and sadly. I am pissed on behalf of the journalists sold snake oil. So Finkelstein tried to blame the failure on expenses, right? $50 million they had. $8 million office, $900,000 salary for its editor-in-chief, and a tumultuous media market already teeming with layoffs. The reporters have filed a class action lawsuit against Finkelstein for violating a state statute requiring advance notice for layoffs. But the owner with bottomless pockets model of journalism has also stumbled during this period of time. Billionaires would love to point the blame elsewhere than themselves for the sudden media apocalypse. It's not hard to notice the recent vigor in scooping up some of the biggest names in the business, especially while many of them arrive at the opportunity with zero prior media experience. Damn. And there are more stories in here in the same way. The LA Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, among others. The San Diego Union Tribune was sold to Media News Group, a newspaper company owned by hedge fund Alden Global Capital. They ruthlessly squeeze local papers for every local drop of cash that has been referred to as the Grim Reaper and a destroyer of newspapers. Thomas H. Lee Partners, Bain Capital. That's what, that's what iHeartMedia was going through, right? It's the thing that happens. These media companies, they're just milking these companies along and just falling apart. So earlier this month, media magnate David Smith scooped up the Baltimore Sun from Alden Global Capital. High expectations for the 187-year-old newspaper to closely resemble another one of his media properties, the Sinclair Broadcast Group. He believes they can make it more profitable with some heavy-handed changes, expecting Sun staff to conduct unscientific online polls on a daily basis, veering away from what Smith described as left-wing meaningless dribble, and order staffers to go make me some money. And if there's any light at the dark tunnel, it's the industry consumed and operated by venal and blundering fat cats is not the only option on the table. Journalism can still thrive when its business model is motivated by stability rather than quick mass profit. Amen. Citizen journalists, listen, just go back to my interview with Nicole Jordan a while back. We talked about this. The big model of journalism and the money they're trying to make is delusional. Delusional. Do you understand that? And it's too bad that it's doing that, but we're getting more and more. The Atlantic has put out a story saying that is American journalism headed towards an extinction level event? There's a lot of people that feel like what's going on. And they're all talking about what's going on here. And it's not just newspapers. Television is the same way. A presidential election cycle that tends to produce a surge of readers, viewers, and advertisers as people pay closer attention to the news. Not this time. Traffic to leading news sites, Nielsen ratings, and national cable news shows are down throughout 2023. Efforts to arrest the news media's decline have been going on for years. Philanthropic organizations like the Knight Foundation and the Lenfest Institute for Journalism that owns the Philadelphia Inquirer. They've poured hundreds of millions of dollars into reporting initiatives, almost all aimed at local news. The MacArthur Foundation spent $500 million over 5 years, and they're leading a coalition of 20-odd charitable organizations to address what MacArthur's president, John Palfrey, has said, calling a threat to our democracy. The grants have not been yet announced, but moving along. They're trying to go ahead and put the idea, as we've talked about before, trying to get money from the big tech platforms to help stop the bleeding. Now, the Atlantic, they cite what publishers have been doing right now in Australia, the News Media Bargaining Code, the law creating a framework for publishers to negotiate payments from tech giants. And the law in Australia has resulted in more than $140 million a year in payments, according to one former government official who implemented the bargaining code. A fraction of the $424 billion that Google and Facebook's parent companies collected in revenues last year, but real money to awesome media companies. And this apparent success in supporting journalism has spurred some of the proposals in Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Indonesia, Brazil, Switzerland, and South Africa. And California might do their own state-level bargaining code this year. And there has been a bill introduced in Congress by 2 senators trying to do the same thing. But then other companies, well, like Facebook, they decided to block news in Canada rather than paying publishers there. Still not going to change anything. If you think that's what you have to go and do to keep the news industry afloat, you're going to make other people flip the bill? When these news companies can't pay themselves, they cannot make the money on their own? Pitiful. But that's what they think they can do. They really do. Okay, a few other stories I want to bring up before we wrap things up. I mentioned TikTok. Right now, the Billboard TikTok Top 50 chart. You know, because of the Universal Music Group and their ban of the music being used on that platform, some people have been very funny on doing it because there are those creators that relied on the music going on from these platforms, and they are getting really creative to create new content. Meanwhile, there are other artists that I see that are creating music that is starting to take the place of what these other artists might have had. Like right now, I mean, we might not be getting music from Taylor Swift and Ariana Grande regularly on the platform, but I see music from Madison Beer, Charlie XCX, and among others that are because they're on different labels. That's just what happens. Dua Lipa also is another one of the examples, but like that's one of those things that are going on. 17 tracks on the Billboard TikTok Top 50 can no longer be used on the app. So everything's just changing around. So recent releases are being impacted as a result. Ariana Grande's Yes and, songs from Nicki Minaj's December album, Sophia Ellis-Bextor's Murder on the Dance Floor, they all took a hit. But users can still be able to make videos an official orchestral version of Murder on the Dance Floor because it's licensed to a different label. And even though UMG's and TikTok's licensing agreement expired, there are other songs that might find a way to get themselves on the platform and still keep moving along. And TikTok's had long had a vibrant bootleg scene, which means that in some cases, users have uploaded their own versions of UMG songs or made remixes in place of the official sounds. The bootlegs were also a source of frustration for the record company, which said last week that TikTok makes little effort to deal with vast amounts of content on its platform that infringe our artists' music. Well, you know what? Get the deal done. Let's get the deal done. Enough of this. I don't know what else you want to do about this, but you need to get this taken care of. Let's get the deal done. If all these other, publishers are out there and they're getting themselves taken care of, then, TikTok can work with them too. We talked about this last week. There are other places to make your money instead of going after TikTok. You're going after the wrong enemy here. Just saying. Meanwhile, the music industry is still kind of hurting because another story that's being talked about, and a digital rights tech company estimates that there are more than 1 million unauthorized remixes floating around streaming services, which means there are certain songs that have sped up remixes that the music industry is not making money off of. Now, this is going back a while, but that's one of those things that came out as well that people are going to consider, right? Interesting to talk about this here. Now, in the UK, they have the Brit Awards, and they're very popular. Their Grammy Awards ceremony, which I think is in March. And it really does make a big difference. Like there's a bump when you go and watch the Grammys. There is a bump that goes off of that for music. The Super Bowl will have a bump right now because I'm sure some of Usher's catalog will automatically go up into the charts because as a result of his performance at the Super Bowl. Pretty sure that's going to happen. That halftime show always makes a big difference. And he's got an album he's getting ready to go and put out, all that kind of good stuff going on, so that'll work well for him. What about the Grammys? 16 million viewers watched it this year. And the Hot 100 might see some old favorites getting bumped up by their Grammy moments. So one of the songs everybody's talking about a lot of that got a whole lot of press from the Grammys was Luke Combs getting to perform alongside Tracy Chapman, Fast Car. Tracy Chapman still got the voice. She can still play it. She's still very good. Luke Combs was having a ball out there doing it. That was fun. And that was great. And I think there is going to be a chance that Fast Car by Tracy Chapman will make her way, that song will make it back up to Hot 100 once again. There will be a Grammy bump. Meanwhile, we're looking at the other things that are going on right now that Jack Harlow's Living on Me most likely will be the front runner to return number one after, Hiss by Megan Thee Stallion reached number one this week. So we might see that happen. A comeback might be coming for that. Now, after Fast Car was performed at the Grammys, the song is number one on the iTunes sales chart, top 100 of Spotify's daily top songs USA chart for the first time. And Luke Combs' cover has also seen a bump, climbing back into the iTunes top 5, rebounding the Spotify's US top 40, but has been slowing on the Hot 100, reached number 2 last July, and was in the top 10 in January, but still Parks at number 20 on the chart as of this week. And Flowers by Miley Cyrus might make her way back up to the charts once again because of her song being up there. Billie Eilish, What Was I Made For, might also make its way up there because it was also performed at the Grammys, among others. So let's see what happens overall and see if anybody really talks about it, if it does come into play. Odyssey is going to get a little bit of money back now to go ahead and pay off some of their bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court has okayed a settlement with BMI that will pay Odyssey $25 million to put towards their bills. So a settlement agreement has been made with BMI, the copyright royalty organization, that performance rights organization, excuse me. They have to pay the broadcaster $25 million in proceeds from its equity stake. And the payout and other longtime BMI stakeholders stems from the pending purchase by a New Mountain Capital-led shareholder group in a transaction that's expected to occur by the end of this quarter. The settlement represents a compromise since BMI claims Odyssey owes $10.9 million in unpaid music, licensing fees, and interest. And so they settled. BMI will pay Odyssey a $25.4 million for its stake in the performance rights organization. Odyssey could also pocket an additional $13.58 million from additional shares of BMI it says it owns, if they're not contested by another party or claiming ownership within a certain period of time after the sale closes. Still, it's chump change compared to the fact there's still, hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Just saying. Still got $350 million in the hole. How are you going to fix that? $30 million is just a drop in the well. An interesting story in Fort Myers, Florida. There is a CHR battle going right now. Two pop stations going against each other. One is WXKB B103.9, which is a perennial top 40 radio station in Fort Myers. Nobody's beaten it for years. They're the number one hit music station in their market. They have a new station in the market now, Hot 93.7, that has been brought into play. And for whatever it's worth, people are going to really be looking at what's going on here. The last time we saw something like this really come out, where one station as a new upstart going up against a perennial, you have to go back to 1989, right? WRBQ Q105 was a top 40 that effectively evolved to Hot AC because they got out of the whole top 40 radio market because of the fact that the power pig, WFLZ 93.3 FM, came along and left Q105 dithering between chasing the listeners who had left and alienated those who had stayed for a reason. Q105 at the time was a big target. And even in 1989, with one with the unusual vulnerabilities, B103.9 is typical of today's CHR. The audience is there. Hot 93.7 is going after B103.9 in a launch promo that seeks to position the incumbent as the old and tired. And the station is over 31 years old and plays way too many commercials and really bad music. And this has happened for a lot of stations. I remember, we used to have this thing going on with one of the stations in Miami, Party 93.1, that they complained about how many commercials Power 96 would play in an hour. Sometimes they would play up to 16 to 18 commercials an hour. Meanwhile, Party 93.1 would play like 8 or 6 or 4. Like I think at the beginning, they only played up to 2 minutes of commercials an hour. Something like that. Now, what Hot 93.7 decided to do is they brought in a longtime Minneapolis, Minnesota program director who worked at KDWB at her perennial top 40 station in that market, brought him back into work on contemporary hit radio. So now, who's the enemy of all this? When it comes to these stations and trying to regrow their shares. So, Sean Ross, he writes about this and says, quote, first of all, is it the incumbent CHR? The lessons of politics established well before our current fraught times. There's no benefit to not going negative, and a weak incumbent is even a better target because, unlike Q105, people are already aware that they're unhappy. But what happens when stealing half of an incumbent's peak share gets you at 1.8? Q105 was making contrarian music choices to play oldies in 1989. B103.9 is playing terrible music. It's because what CHRs has available now. Hot 93.7 has those same songs too, although its current, recurrent throwback proportions felt a little newer. Is it streaming? Is it TikTok to blame? He says, I do sense vulnerabilities in both, as well as an opportunity for radio to reestablish itself again as a better curator and a better entertainment experience. I think those selling points can be made to resonate with the moms who grew up with B103.9 and create greater enthusiasm for them. But could you make an 18-year-old realize you're unhappy, as WFLZ did? Right now, TikTok is the one thing that evokes team passion and community in the way radio did for us. And how would a new broadcast station get the message out to them if they're unlikely to hear it on our air? Well, something about that Hot 93.7 format is interesting. Because I get to go and program, a playlist. It's not, a big audience out there. I don't get a whole lot of people listening to it, but I use it to kind of like get my idea of what stations can be doing these days. So the recurrent throwback proportions felt a little newer. Now, what Sean Ross is saying is something that a lot of stations, when there were top 40 radio stations, would do. They would play, songs that were flashbacks or rewinds. You would have throwback songs, and currents and recurrents also brought into play. Like the newest songs wouldn't always be the newest songs played all the time, because you would, expand the playlist. So my own experimental thing I would listen to is that I tried to think about, okay, I have a playlist called All the Hits plus the Hard Rock and Rap. It's kind of a throwback to the 90s. That was a very popular term put out there on radio. When you didn't want to have the rap or rock music on a particular station, you wanted to be for soccer moms, you'd say all the hits without the hard rock and rap. Well, I say with. And what I also notice is that, okay, if I want to play the rock and rap and include all the hits and all this good stuff, I wanted to see if I could create a station that, just on the Spotify playlist, if I could create a format that I think people could really resonate with. So, songs that could be brand new, that are just hit music songs. Add them into the mix of songs from the 2010s, 2000s, into the 90s. Of course, the heyday of rock music still has to be, for this particular alternative format we have now, mid-90s until the 2010s, basically. I had that in there. I also take music from the UK and in Europe that's also in there that, will never got any play over here, and I put that into this particular playlist. And then I take hip-hop, and I take, some R&B, but then some of it that's like a little more, I take some of it and move it away. Like the cutoff, for the most part, when it comes to the music on that playlist, is 1994. Because that's basically like there was a change of music going on right then and there. The 80s sounding music of the early 90s was already gone by that point. We were getting the 90s really kicked in 94. 93, not yet. Not yet. 94 really made a difference. That's when you had Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots and all the alternative music really making their way in big time. Big time. 92, 93, yes, but 94 was really at its peak, and stations started putting up alternative signals across the country. Hip-hop, by that point, was no longer a format that you would just embed into an R&B station. Hip-hop was a standalone format by 94. See, everything started getting compartmentalized, and stations started getting segmented. That's really when things changed. And on top of that, the internet had started by that point. So, by 95, 96, 97, you started having people that could go ahead and listen to music on downloads and, listen to it on their iPods. Everything just changed by then. Things just started moving differently. And so, that's the part that happened. Okay, digital really came into play. Physical units, by that point, were starting to go by the wayside. It was becoming less and less. Now, also, the other enemy they talk about is older music. He says here, after several years of a throwback boom, there's no particular joy in hearing Down by Jay Sean anymore. But I don't know that CHR's increased reliance in the aughts, the 2000s, is a big enough target. So, especially with Usher back in the charts, the new Justin Timberlake song that's just dropped. And he wonders if I could perhaps do something with that. In a market with the number one station is playing Baby Come Back on the theme from The Greatest American Hero. I wonder if Hotter B103.9 can make a statement about the amount of older music being played in the market overall. So these are all considerations here and what's going on with the format of music and where things are right now. I don't know. Interesting thought in radio, which is kind of like sometimes how I go ahead and I wrap up these programs like this. So I am done tonight. That is the program. Thank you for listening in. Finding this program as you always do. kingofpodcasts.com is the website for all my content. So if you're looking for it, please look for it there. And like I said, I redesigned it, did a little bit of work to it. You know, I'm on X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, LinkedIn, at King of Podcasts. And the website, you can find all my content. Easy to get the Spotify playlist for the programs that I do. Rescues for Podcasts, the Praise and Debaucherous program, Podcasters Row, and of course all the playlists I was talking about just before. So come back for another Broadcasters Podcast, because content is king and the control of your content is in your hands.